My name's Dave, and I'm one of the pastors here. And here's the thing. It is probably one of the most recognized teachings of Jesus ever. I mean, whether you are an agnostic, an atheist, or you grew up going to Sunday school, if you've heard of Jesus, then you've probably heard his teaching to love your neighbor. Everybody with me on that? You've heard him say, love your neighbor. You know that's one of the things he wants you to do. But here's the thing. There's different kinds of love. Like, I love my wife, and I love my kids, but I also love tacos. Can I get an amen, right? I love tacos too. So there's a different kind of love for different kinds of things. So what exactly is Jesus saying I got to do for my neighbor? Like, is it enough that when I go out and get the mail and I see my neighbor like taking his garbage out, is it enough that I go, hey man, like, is that love? Is that good enough? Or am I supposed to be doing something else? Well, there's a description of love in 1 Corinthians 13. Now, as soon as I say that, you might say, well, I've heard that at a wedding. That's the Bible verse for weddings. It wasn't really written for that. It was just written as a description of love. So I'm going to share this description with you, and it's not going to be up on the screen. I'm just going to read it for you. But I want you to imagine your neighbor as I say it. And we'll see how well we're doing at loving our neighbor, okay? It says here that love is patient. Are you patient with your neighbor? I got a guy on my road that does not take his Christmas lights down until about May, all right? Till about this time of year. And here's the thing. If you don't take your Christmas lights down, once February hits, it's a sin, all right? You just need to know that. And I'm just kidding. But am I patient? Are you patient with your neighbor? Love is kind. It does not envy. So when your neighbor gets that nice new shiny car, you're not supposed to envy that. That's not loving. How are you doing? It does not boast. When he gets the new car and he comes up and talks to you about your vacation, do you want to throw at him? Yeah, we were in Europe and it was a beautiful vacation. Like, do you need to boast? Because that's not loving. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. In other words, you don't get up on a stage and announce to everybody that somebody in your neighborhood doesn't put the Christmas lights down. I just dishonored my neighbor, so I'm not very loving. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. How do you do when your neighbor's dog, he lets him out in the morning and he yaps and yaps and yaps? It's not easily angered. It keeps no records of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects. It always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres, and love never fails. Now, I got to be honest. I read that description of love. That's kind of a high bar. And when I think of my neighbor, I don't know that I even have the chance to apply that kind of love to my neighbor because I barely know my neighbor. How about you? I mean, you think about the people that live over here or over there or maybe in front of you across the street or behind you. Do you know them all that well? If you live in an apartment, do you know the people on your floor? Do you know the people in your door? What about where you work? Maybe your neighbor is the people that are in the cubicles or the offices next to you. Do you know them all that well, or do you just know their name? And we're supposed to have this kind of love that always hopes and always perseveres and always trusts. You see, Jesus comes around and he doesn't only just redefine what love is, he redefines who your neighbor is. If you're here the first week, they told you about the Good Samaritan. Jesus tells this parable about a Good Samaritan where they come along and they find somebody in need. And Jesus' point is this. It's not just, your neighbor is not just your physical neighbor, the person that lives there and lives there. Your neighbor is anybody that you come across that needs something. Love them. And then Jesus throws it in. He's making up this story. And he's like, oh, I'm going to get these Jewish people. And he says, yeah, I'm going to make them a Samaritan. And the Jews and the Samaritans hated each other. And Jesus is saying, not only is it somebody you come across that has a need, guess what? It's somebody that might look different than you. They might have a different skin color than you. That's your neighbor. He said, you know what? It might be somebody that believes different than you do about theological things. Guess what? That's your neighbor. He says, guess what? It might be somebody that votes different than you. Whoa. Yeah, that's your neighbor too. And Jesus redefines love and he redefines neighbor. And I love it. Well, last week then, we looked at the orphans. It was a great week. Oh my goodness. So many wonderful things across our campus. We saw a family out here that They weren't even going to come to church, the story told. One of the pastors told me they weren't even sure if they were coming to church. They were a little frustrated because they didn't have money and they were looking to adopt. And they said after the service, one of the people in their small group came up and gave them a check and said, this is our next step with God. We want to help you adopt a kid. Guys, that's what church is all about. That's loving your neighbor. You can clap. I saw a couple people go like this. You were like, can I do that? Yes, you can. That's exciting stuff. But last week, here's the thing. Jesus goes up to the Father. He ascends into heaven, and then the church begins. And it spreads like wildfire, guys. It's like from house to house to house to house to house. And like half of Jerusalem becomes Christ followers. And then people get in a boat and they take it over to Europe and they take it over to Asia. And it spreads there, and it's just spreading and spreading and spreading. And about 30 years later, James is one of these early church leaders, and he's going to write a letter. He also happens to be the half-brother of Jesus. His book, by the way, is cleverly titled James. And in his book, he's going to write something to this rapidly expanding church. And it dawns on me, as we looked at that last week, that that's for us. That we are a rapidly expanding church. I mean, we're just growing and growing all the time. And I think that what James said to those people who were rapidly expanding, he said this, it could be applied to us. Here's what he said. He said, you know what real religion is? You think you're religious? You want to know what religion is that's acceptable and pleasing to God? He said, look after the orphans and look after the widows. And don't be corrupted by the world. That's what he said. He said, if you want to get it right, that's what religion is. And I can imagine that he would write that letter to us. Hey, 242, guess what? Love that you made a soccer field. Beautiful, that's great. Like God's up going, great, you made a soccer field. Good for you. Now you got buildings, that's good. There's a slide coming into your church. Wow, that's exactly how I imagined it. Do you think God was just waiting for somebody to come along to figure out we need to put a slide in a church? You think he's up in heaven going, wow, that church, I'm very impressed with that church. No! God is saying, you know what? The slides are fine, and the smoke is fine, and all that's fine as long as those things don't distract you from the main thing. They help you with the main thing, and the main thing is you better love your neighbor. And your neighbor, you need to understand, are the widows and orphans, because the widows and orphans, they're hopeless and helpless. They were hopeless and helpless back in that society, folks. If you weren't connected to a man, then you couldn't get a job and you couldn't own property. So if you were a widow and an orphan, you were hopeless and helpless. And so God would say to you, 242, to us, 242, you can put all the smoke in a room you want, you get a cool band, you get a soccer field, but if that stuff distracts you from the main thing, then I ain't giving you the clap. I'm waiting for you to take care of the widows and the orphans. I want you to help and love your neighbor. Isn't God good? Isn't God good? Well, now he comes to this week. Well, goodness, God, you whipped us up one side and down the other. I mean, what else are you going to tell us? And I think God would tell us this week that our neighbor is also the person who is living next to us, who is in the cubicle next to us, who's on the line with us. And as we talk to them about sports and the weather, and we imagine that their life is perfect, maybe we see them on Facebook. You know how many of us have hundreds of people on Facebook, and we look at their perfect little life, and we think they're probably fine. But God would say, you don't even know. You don't even know how many people are hurting. There's a guy, Tim Sanders, was a C-level executive at Yahoo at one time. And he was trying to get the word out that we need to be encouraging to the people that we lead. And his company, somebody emailed him, one of the managers, and can I read this to you? It's a little long, but man, it's powerful. He says, Tim, I have 9 software engineers that work for me, several of which I've never even met because even though we work in the same building, we communicate only by email. And I decided to take seriously what you said and share 2 reasons I think they're wonderful. I'm going to encourage them. And so I went around to each cubicle and I walked in and I put my arm around each one of my folks and I told them 2 reasons I admired them. And a couple days later, one of my engineers, I'll call him Lenny, he comes up to me with a poorly wrapped but well-intentioned gift, an Xbox game console. And I knew I hadn't given Lenny a raise since I don't remember when, and I said, where'd you get the money? And he looked back at me and he said the words you never really want to hear as a manager who has ignored their people. I sold my 9mm. which got my attention totally on the spot. Lenny went on to say, I moved here from Denver when my mom died, and she was really my only friend. And when she died, I was totally alone. So I thought I'd move and start over again with a new company. And I've actually never made a friend here at this company. And if I died, payroll would basically have to let you know. I got depressed, and I'm online all the time. So I went online and I found chat rooms that would teach me how to get up the courage to kill myself. I took a paycheck and I bought a 9mm and a box of bullets. I started a routine every night after work of eating a bowl of ramen noodles, listening to music, and getting the gun out. It took almost a month to get the courage to put the bullets in the gun. It took another couple of months to get used to the feeling of the barrel of the gun on the top of my teeth. For the last few weeks, I was putting ever so slight pressure on that trigger. And I was getting so close, Steve, so close. And then the other day, you freaked me out. You came into my cubicle, and I don't even know you. And you put your arm around me, and you told me that I turn in every project a day early, which helps you sleep at night. And you told me I was funny over email. And then you said, Lenny, I'm glad you came into my life. And I went home that night and I listened to my music and I ate my ramen noodles and the safety was off and I was close, this close, dude. I was scared. And then I said out loud the words that saved my life. I'm glad you came into my life, Lenny. And I repeated those again and again and again. And I got up the next day and I went to the pawn shop and they gave me $250 for the gun. And for months, you've been complaining on email and that your financial controller, aka your wife, will not let you purchase an Xbox because you've got that new baby at home to feed. And so, Steve, for my life, this gift is for you. Thanks, boss. Now, that's a jaw hitting the floor example of the fact that you never know. You just never know about the people that are living next to you and going to school with you and working in the office next door. You just don't know what's going on in their lives. And you might be Facebook friends and seeing where they went on vacation and you know what sports team they like or whatever, but you just don't really know what's going on in these outsiders' lives, these people that are kind of ostracized and put out by society for whatever reason it is. You just don't really know. 25% of Americans have no one to confide in, experts say. American Medical Association rates loneliness up there with obesity as one of the leading causes of premature death. The average American has only 2 friends, which is down from 3 since 1985. So something happened in 1985, and we voted that third guy off the island. Now we only have 2 friends, and it's just going down really steep. It's actually like, 1.9, then a few years later it's 1.5 and 1.6, which means in a few years you're just going to be sitting by yourself listening to country music. All right, because they're sad songs. Okay, anyway. But Luke 5 comes along, and Jesus shows us how to reach out to the outsiders. He comes along to a guy named Peter. Now, you need to understand, Peter was a good Jewish boy. He'd grown up in school, and he was learning his Old Testament and his Levitical law, and he was reciting all that and memorizing all that. But it didn't measure up. You see, back then, all the kids wanted to be rabbis. They all wanted to be preachers. The preachers were the rock stars, kind of like it is today. Everybody wants to be a preacher. And, all the kids are looking up to them. And that's, everybody wanted to do that. And the mom would have been so proud, but if you didn't make the cut, well, then you just went and you did your father's work. You took over the family business. And so Peter, he became a fisherman. He was an establishment outsider. He didn't fit into the higher echelon of social society. But Jesus comes along and he sees Peter and he sees something different. And says, even though he's an establishment outsider, I think he's got what it takes. And he says, Peter, come and follow me. And Peter, it says, dropped his nets. In verse 11, it says, so they pulled their boats up on the shore and they left everything and followed him. They just left their boats there. If you have a boat, would you just leave it? He just left his boat. He left his career. He left everything to follow Jesus. And I always thought, does Jesus have some sort of like hypno eyes or something? He just walks up and says, come follow me. And they all go like, yes, I'll go. No, what's happening is his whole life, Peter was told he didn't have what it takes to be a rabbi. And then here comes this rabbi that everybody had been talking about. And the rabbi looks at him and goes, no, I think you have what it takes. Come on. That'd be like somebody from the Golden State Warriors coming up to me and going, hey man, I think you got what it takes to play in the NBA. Come on. I'd be like, forget ministry. I'm going to the NBA, man. I've got what it takes. I've always dreamed of doing that. Just never had a jump shot. But anyway, so let me ask you, who do you know that other people have passed up? That's your neighbor. Who do you know that gets picked last? That's your neighbor. Who do you know that doesn't get invited to the get-togethers and the parties? Guess what? That's your neighbor. And you're supposed to love them. Well, verse 12 comes along, all in the same passage of Scripture. It's just amazing to me. Jesus, it said, sat in one of the towns, and a man came along who was covered with leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground, and he begged him, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Now, what you may or may not know is that the people in that day, when they were leprosy, they ran around saying unclean, because leprosy was contagious, but also it sort of took on this spiritual meaning as well. Because people thought if you're going to get leprosy, it's probably because there's sin in your life and God's judging you. So here's somebody who's a spiritual outsider. And Jesus said, no. I love you. I'm going to care for you. I'm going to serve you. Who do you know? Who's in your life that's blown it morally? That's your neighbor. Who's walking around feeling shame and in need of a second chance in your life? Love your neighbor. Verse 18, some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a mat and tried to take him into the house and lay him before Jesus. This guy's a physical outsider. He didn't have physically what it took. And Jesus said, you know what? I'm going to serve you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to reach out to you. Who do you know that physically can't keep up? They're elderly, poor, they don't have their physical needs met, disability. Who do you know that needs help? That's your neighbor. Jesus said, love your neighbor. And then verse 27 and 28. Oh, Jesus, you're beating us up tonight. Holy cow. After this, Jesus went out and he saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. Follow me, Jesus said. Jesus always has a bass voice, by the way. Jesus is never a tenor, all right? Just want you to know that. When you meet Jesus, he's not going to go, hey, how you doing? He's going to say, I'm just kidding. I made that up. All right, follow me. Jesus said to him, and Levi got up and he left everything and followed him. Now, I think all the disciples probably said, okay, wait a second. A leper, that's one thing, Jesus. Peter, I went to school with him. That's one thing, Jesus. A paralytic, okay. But a tax collector, come on. It's not like it is today where IRS workers are well respected. In fact, I'd like to say into the camera to all the people watching online, the thousands of people, how much I appreciate the IRS workers and how I don't need an audit in any way at this church or in my private life. Now, you see, we tease about the IRS, but the truth is these people were cheaters. They didn't follow the rules. They were working for the Romans. Levi was a Jew who was working for the Romans. He was a traitor. And then he would jack up the taxes. He was just like completely despised by the people. He was a social outsider. Nobody liked him. And yet Jesus saw something in him. In fact, that's the first thing that Jesus did. By the way, let's just go through real quick. We'll use Levi and we'll think of the things that Jesus did, and then we'll do those things. Jesus saw people. It says in verse 27, after this, Jesus went out and he saw a tax collector by the name of. You see, to be a neighbor, I have to see you. I'm ashamed to say it. When I waited tables in the city, The first night that I parked my car and I got out and I walked down to the restaurant, I was like nervous at how many homeless people that there were. People asking for money, begging for money, and I saw one there and I saw one there, and I kind of scooted over to get away from that one there and to avoid and to move and to get down to the restaurant. Do you know, after a couple of years of working in the city, I didn't even see him anymore. I mean, I'm ashamed to say that, but the truth is that there's something about us, or maybe I'm the only one, that somehow the people in our lives, and the helpless and the homeless and the people that need, and the hopeless, sometimes just fade into the backdrop of life. And I don't even see them anymore. And Jesus would say, you know what? Jesus saw a tax collector. Maybe a good thing for you and I to do would be to map out our neighborhood and go, okay, they live there and they live there and they live there and they live there. And I am going to figure out their name, what they do for a living, what they do for fun, and their kids' names. And that way, when I see them out cutting the grass, I can at least say, hey, how's life as an engineer? Or catch any fish recently? And maybe God would open up the door for us to see past an outsider's facade and get to the real issues in their life, and then we could love our neighbors. He saw the tax collector. And the other thing he did was, he took this Levi and he changed his name to Matthew, by the way. And Matthew means gift of God. And so Jesus took a guy who was stealing and everybody thought was a traitor and everybody thought he was materialistic and consumeristic and all this. And Jesus said, no, he is gift of God. Jesus saw something in him. And what would it be like if you looked at your neighbor and the whole time you're like praying? Maybe when you're out walking your dog, you're just praying around the neighborhood. God, help me to see these people the way you see them. And that little teenager that's running down the road in his car, and his bass is obnoxious, and he needs a muffler, and you just kind of want to shake your head in disgust. Maybe you look at that guy, you know what, but he could be a leader. God, I want to see him the way you see him. Or you see that elderly person and you think, but you know what, maybe God would have you see them for who they could be. Love your neighbor. See your neighbor. Here's the other one, negative assumptions. Jesus come along, and for two of those people, he said, come along with me. Now, in Aramaic, this was like a sort of like a formal invitation that the rabbis would use to bring people along. And so even though Jesus was rabbi among rabbis, like Lord of Lords, teacher of teachers, he didn't mind sounding like the other guys. And I'm sure there was a danger in that. I mean, Jesus would love to kind of stand out a little bit, distinguish himself a little bit, because the other guys maybe didn't always get it right. But he didn't. Now, I can relate to that, because as I'm out in the community, I want to tell people I want to love them, I want to care for them, I want to listen to them, get to know them. And inevitably, somebody says, hey, well, what do you do for a living, Dave? Nice to meet you. And they go, what do you do for a living? And I go, I don't want to tell them. Because as soon as I tell them, I'm weird to them, right? I work at a church. Like, the conversation just stops, I get it. I've seen the people on TV. Stick your hands in them jeans and pull out them greens. Don't make me holler. Don't make me shout. Just turn them pockets inside out. You give to me and I'll pray for you and everything's going to be great. I've seen those people, and I know that as soon as I say I work at a church, people go, oh, here we go. Right? But you're the same way. Now, you don't work at a church maybe, but as soon as you put a 242 sticker on your car, people go, oh, you're part of that place. I've heard things. Or when you're out and you say you want to invite somebody, you know that what this person really needs is church. They need Jesus, and they meet Jesus in this place. But you're like, do I really want to invite them to church? Like when you're at the office and you know what that person needs is Jesus, and yet somehow it's hard for you to even say the words. I want you to think about this week when you're out with your neighbors. Would you ever say, how hard would it be to say the name, Jesus, to the people on the line and in the office? We have to get past worrying about what everybody else would think. Man, I was out one time eating with some friends, and there was this new guy who was a Christian, and I didn't know him real well, but we're out to eat together. And the server comes up, introduces himself, and takes our order, and then brings the food. When they bring the food, this guy just pops up and says, now before we eat the food, we're going to pray. Is there anything we can pray for you for? And I wanted to hide under the table. I'm like, they're going to think we're a religious fanatic, right? And you know what? It was interesting because the server was just like, oh, well, thanks. Actually, no. There's nothing you can pray for me for, but the person in the back, they had a house fire and they were uninsured. And maybe you could pray for them. And so this guy says, all right, we will. And sure enough, when we pray before the food, we're praying for this person. And then we got done with the food, and the guy's like, hey, we ought to take up a collection and leave a huge tip for that person. Now you're speaking my language. That sounds good. Let's do it. So we're all contributing money, and we end up giving like $250 to this person. And it's just like, that's the cool stuff that can happen where you're not so flipping worried about how people see you. I love it. Here's the other one, risk rejection. Risk rejection. You know what? If somebody says no to you, like, hey, can I pray for you? No. You want to come to church? No. Is that the worst thing that can happen? I'll tell you what, you're in good company. It happened to Jesus. In Mark 10, Jesus was like, come on. The guy's like, I don't want to change my lifestyle. He said no to Jesus. Later on, there was a guy that said, hey, following you would mess up my relationship with my dad. So Jesus, no. And I just want to say, like, it's not the worst thing in the world as we love our neighbors for our neighbors to go, no thanks. And it could be that you're just one of the steps, one of the seeds that gets planted that later on God's going to use that. They're going to be thinking later on, back to, oh, wow, okay, well, maybe God might use that in somebody's life. So don't be afraid of rejection. Can I give you another one? And I think this is a big one, busyness. Some of us are just too busy to love our neighbor. Some of us are too busy to love our kids. We're just too busy. And we imagine that Jesus was like, well, it's easy for him because Jesus just kind of floated around at half speed, patting kids on the head and holding sheep and looking off into the distance like, whatever. Like Jesus didn't have a schedule. Do you know how many people were clamoring for Jesus? Jesus, teach us. Jesus, come to our town and teach us. Jesus, come to my home and heal my family. Come to me, Jesus. Come. I mean, people were clamoring for Jesus' attention all the time at points where he had to say, you know what? Hey, I got to get away. I got to go be with the Father and recharge. Like Jesus would create margin in his schedule. And guess what? As he did that then, he was available to be interrupted. And if you look, some of the great stories of Jesus loving on somebody is when he got interrupted. It'll say Jesus was on his way to, and someone walked up to him. Now let me ask you, how busy are you? If you were walking somewhere, if you were on your way to somewhere and someone called you up and said, hey man, you got a time to talk? I'm like, nope. I got to get somewhere. I remember when we were starting the church. I remember standing in the office. We were at the fitness club. And this lady comes up and she's like, hey, I heard you're starting a new church in a couple of months. Does anybody have time to talk about it? I'm like, no, I don't have time to talk about that. I didn't say that. That's what I thought. And then I thought, how stupid is that? I'm sitting here working, thinking about starting a church. She's over here going, hey, I'd be interested in the church. And I'm like, I'm too busy? What is that about? But we're too busy. I was so proud of our Ann Arbor campus guys. Last Saturday, I spoke down there. We talked about the orphan thing. And afterwards, I went out and I was talking to one of the ladies that was one of the agencies that came. Y'all had agencies here. They had agencies down there. And I was talking to the lady and saying, what are the ways that a church could help? And they were telling me all these things about respite care and safe families and all this, you could do this and do that and help people. And one of the things she said, well, you could tell she was getting kind of fired up. And she goes, it'd be great. So it would be great sometime. This has never happened, but what would be great is if the church because we always need diapers and we always need wipes. It'd be great if a church just did like a little baby shower for us. And I don't know what she was thinking. Like down in the basement of the church, there was a little room and we had people come together. But I was driving home Saturday night and I thought, well, why not? So at the end of the message on Sunday, the two messages, at the end of the message, I said, hey, everybody, they need diapers and wipes. Why don't we, since Jesus said to love our neighbor instead of just talking about it, why don't we go do it? And I sent them all out, and I said, I dare you, I challenge you, I encourage you, please don't make me look stupid. Go out and get some diapers and wipes. And then after the service was over, I went and sat in the parking lot just to see what would happen. And this is what happened. And that's about half of it. Over 25,000 diapers, over 50,000 wipes, and then another $5,000 in food, bottles, formula, cribs, and other items came in. And they delivered them this week, and people were crying, and it was awesome. And I was just sitting in the parking lot weeping because I'm thinking, these people, they had plans. They were going to go to lunch. They were going to go watch the ball game. They were going to go visit with their family or whatever, but they had time to get interrupted and to go and to love their neighbor. Don't be so busy that you can't love your neighbor. Let me give you one last one. It's a heart check. I'm running out of time. It says in verse 29, then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with him. In other places it says disreputable people. So just a big Jesus party with a bunch of sinners. I love it. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples. These are the religious muckety-mucks. Hey, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Jesus answered, is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick? I've come to call the righteous, or not to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. And sometimes we won't love the outsider because we're just so dang full of ourselves. And I was doing this college ministry, and sure enough, the leaders of the church, not this church, another church, and the leaders of the church are like, hey, Dave, there's all kinds of cigarette butts outside the church building. And I'm thinking, well, at least they're outside. But anyway, cigarette butts outside the church building. What kind of people are you reaching? You need to do something about this. Now, I figure what they meant was they wanted me to tell those people to stop smoking. So what I did was I went out and I bought outdoor ashtrays and I stuck them outside the church because I want to love people where they are. And I'm not going to say that you got to behave just like Jesus to get into this church. I'm not even going to say you have to believe like Jesus to get into this church. What I'm going to say is, hey, we're going to love you right where you are, and we're going to love you too much to leave you like that. We're going to love you no matter who you are, and we're going to tell you about Jesus. And as we love you, you'll believe in Jesus. And as you believe in Jesus, then you'll start to go, well, now he's my Lord and my Savior. I better stop, doing whatever and start following him. But if my heart is not in the right place and I sit around like a Pharisee going, oh, well, you're not saying the right words and doing the right things, and you say Malachi and it's actually Malachi, well, then I might just not be loving my neighbor.